We also have to deal with El Greco's view of Toledo, not this Toledo, but this Toledo. Toledo in Spain. Now, this is the only pure landscape that he will ever paint. But it's a very different landscape, especially when we look at through the eyes of the Renaissance. As we look at it, we have both detail and expressionism happening at the same time. We see El Greco using a very limited palette. We see blues, grays, and greens predominantly. And we see a view of Toledo which is incredibly accurate. It's a city that he would have been particularly familiar with, although he does alter it somewhat. For example, the palace of Alcatraz is moved to the right of the cathedral instead of its more rightful position. But each building is, to some degree, identifiable. Mind you, I didn't say detailed. What he's done is he's used a very loose form of brushwork, both in the clouds in this sort of Mannerist style, similar to what we've seen in the burial of Count Orgaz, and he's transferred it to landscape. The buildings themselves are not all that detailed. The closer you get, the more you realize that they're very simple in form. And yet this simplicity gives us a sense of almost a shaking building, as if he's so passionate about this city that as he paints it, he's doing so rapidly, trying to get an idea out onto the canvas, as if he takes another second to do it, he might lose the concept or lose the idea. Now, there is no narrative here, and the buildings and the landscape seem to be distorted in some way, and actually it's very reminiscent of someone before him. It's very reminiscent of Giorgione, not in the expressionist sort of form that he brings to the buildings in the city of Toledo, but rather in the lack of narrative, as well as in the sort of strange lighting that he's drawing into it. In Giorgione's The Tempest, what we see is poetry on the canvas. And in A View of Toledo, what we have is El Greco kind of capturing the same thing. He's capturing the poetry of the image. He's almost brought mannerism to landscape in a very interesting way. But it's going to open the door to something. So typically in the Renaissance, a landscape is going to be highly detailed. Every building has to be captured with just the right perspective and just the right element of detail so you can sort of go deeper and deeper and deeper into the image. With El Greco's, you can't. There's a limit as to how close you can get before you start losing that element of detail. And in fact, he's going to be influential later on. This idea of the expressionist landscape is going to grow and develop to the point where we actually have to look ahead into the future to see where this becomes most influential, arguably with artists like Van Gogh, who creates an expressionist landscape, in this case, Starry Night. But when you put the two next to each other, the ideas seem so incredibly similar. The difference is El Greco is using a language, a visual language, that would be more recognizable as Renaissance and Mannerist, whereas Van Gogh, of course, will be using something much more modern and that we'll get to later on.